Hello everyone, today we read and comment the fifth chapter of the second book of Von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. We must now be allowed to make a few observations on the instrument of criticism, that is, the language which it uses, because that is to a certain extent connected with the action in war, for the critical examination is nothing more than the deliberation which should precede action in war. We therefore think it very essential that the language used in criticism should have the same character as that which deliberation in war must have, for otherwise it would cease to be practical and criticism could gain no admittance in actual life. We have said in our observations on the theory of the conduct of war what it should educate the mind of the commander for war, or that its teaching should guide his education. Also that it is not intended to furnish him with positive doctrines and systems which he can use like mental appliances. But if the construction of scientific formulae is never required, or even allowable, in war to aid the decision on the case presented, if truth does not appear there in a systematic shape, if it is not found in an indirect way but directly by the natural perception of the mind, then it must be the same also in a critical review. It is true, as we have seen, that wherever complete demonstration of the nature of things would be too tedious, criticism must support itself on those truths which theory has established on the point. But just as in war, the actor obeys these theoretical truths rather because his mind is imbued with them than because he regards them as objective inflexible laws, so criticism must also make use of them not as an external law or an algebraic formula, of which fresh proof is not required each time they are applied, but it must always throw a light on this proof itself, leaving only to theory the more minute and circumstantial proof. Thus it avoids a mysterious, unintelligible phraseology, and makes its progress in plain language, that is, with a clear and always visible chain of ideas. Certainly this cannot always be completely attained, but it must always be the aim in critical expositions. Such expositions must use complicated forms of science as sparingly as possible, and never resort to the construction of scientific aids as of a truth apparatus of its own, but always be guided by the natural and unbiased impressions of the mind. But this pious endeavor, if we may use the expression, has unfortunately seldom either presided over critical examinations. The most of them have rather been emanations of a species of vanity, a wish to make a display of ideas. The first evil which we constantly stumble upon is a lame, totally inadmissible application of certain one-sided systems as of a formal code of laws. But it is never difficult to show the one-sidedness of such systems, and this only requires to be done once to throw discredit forever on critical judgments which are based on them. We have here to deal with a definite subject, and as the number of possible systems after all can be but small, therefore also they are themselves the lesser evil. Much greater is the evil which lies in the pompous retinue of technical terms, scientific expressions, and metaphors which these systems carry in their train, and which, like a rebel, like the baggage of an army broken away from its chief, hang about in all directions. Any critic who has not adopted a system, either because he has not found one to please him, or because he has not yet been able to make himself master of one, will at least occasionally make use of a piece of one, as one would use a ruler to show the blunders committed by a general. The most of them are incapable of reasoning without using as a help here and there some shreds of scientific military theory. The smallest of these fragments, consisting in mere scientific words and metaphors, are often nothing more than ornamental flourishes of the critical narration. Now, it is in the nature of things that all technical and scientific expressions which belong to a system lose their property, if they ever had any, as soon as they are distorted and used as general axioms or small crystalline talismans which have more power of demonstration than simple speech. Thus, it has come to pass that our theoretical and critical books, instead of being straightforward, intelligible dissertations in which the author always knows at least what he says and the reader what he reads, are brimful of these technical terms which form dark points of interference where author and reader part company. But frequently they are something worse, being nothing but hollow shells without any kernel. The author himself has no clear perception of what he means, contents himself with vague ideas, which if expressed in plain language would be unsatisfactory even to himself. A third fault in criticism is the misuse of historical examples and a display of great reading or learning. But the history of art of war is, we have already said, and we shall further explain our views on examples and on military history in general in special chapters. One fact merely touched upon in a very cursory manner may be used to support the most opposite views, and 3 or 4 such facts of the most heterogeneous description, brought together out of the most distant lands and remote times, and headed up, generally distract and bewilder the judgment and understanding without demonstrating anything. For when exposed to the light, they turn out to be only trumpery rubbish, made use of to show off the author's learning. But what can be gained for practical life by such obscure, partly false, confused arbitrary conceptions, so little is gained that theory on account of them has always been a true antithesis of practice, and frequently a subject of ridicule to those whose soldierly qualities in the field are above question. But it is impossible that this could have been the case if theory, in simple language and by natural treatment of those things which constitute the art of making war, had merely sought to establish just so much as admits of being established. If, avoiding all false pretensions and irrelevant display of scientific forms and historical parallels, it had kept close to the subject and gone hand in hand with those who must conduct affairs in the field by their own natural genius. So this is the concluding passage of the 5th chapter, and von Clausewitz here discusses something, in my opinion, that is very important, that fundamentally looks at the instrument of criticism, as he talks about in terms of what the historians usually do in order to build it up fundamentally in its very language and the elements, the evidence that is used or misused, like in this case. But let's see better what he means. So, as we have seen, he writes, we must now be allowed to make a few observations on the instrument of criticism, that is the language which it uses, because that is to a certain extent connected with the action in war. Right? Why? For the critical examination is nothing more than the deliberation which should precede action in war. Right? Always be very mindful about this, that this whole thing is not written to make a theoretical treatise about how a war is from a cultural point of view in every single case, in every single specific situation. This is just essentially a set of notions that is useful for effectively waging war, properly meant. And this is not a minus, this is a plus, right? Because von Clausewitz goes beyond the particularism of every action, and instead he stresses that you will have exclusively to cope largely with your own means with that, because nobody can foresee that for you, and that still being aware that there is a way to cope with certain things in general, right, can be of practical use when you are devoid of a further experience about that contingential reality. So you're right. So therefore, we therefore think it very essential that the language used in criticism should have the same character as that which deliberation in war must have, for otherwise it would cease to be practical, and criticism could gain no admittance in actual life. So in other words, the language used to teach the theory of the art of war should be as simple, right, effective, based on this synthesis capability, be concise but to the point, right? And not losing essentially time in other details that can become even harmful. Especially, once again, bearing in mind that this teaching is aimed at a concrete application, right? And to make this language more complicated would be to lose essentially part of the intellectual potential to disperse it into minor aspects of the story that we don't really care of, right? And so there is this very fascinating parallelism that von Clausewitz traces between effectively the historical teaching and the conduct of war. And this is very important when you talk about military history, because military history, as we've seen in reality, is very complicated, right? It presents enormous difficulties. So when you have to explain something about that, there is a deep exercise that you must learn to make and to implement over time. It is to be precise, simple, effective, and concise at the same time. Right? It's very difficult, right? And you have to essentially point out what truly matters. There is a sort of hierarchy of things you have to say in a given context. And this is pretty evident to anybody who actually writes about it, especially, right? Because you can measure it through the sheer amount of letters that you write, right? How much you can say in fewer sentences, right? This is a great challenge, and you realize through this exercise that what you crossed off actually was something unnecessary, evidently, or that you could express in a more effective way. And the hopeful result is saying the greater amount of stuff in the smallest amount of words. But not only, because as we have seen now, von Clausewitz also refers quite explicitly, this is not much of a dialectical problem, it's also a logical problem. That is, you don't have, like, entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem, right, like Occam would say. This is not just a complexity of language, this is a complexity of logic, that logic by itself should simplify, right, if possible, when possible, because it's not always possible, right? Not everything is so simple to be explained in a few words, but it is also true that we make usually, because it's something very demanding at the end of the day, a very poor use of this synthesis capability, right? Either we basically narrow down the object of the inquiry so that everything becomes very simple, because you can be very proper about every single detail, right? But how important is this detail? This is a very big question you should ask every time we address military historical studies, right? That it's not ultra hyper shrinking, let's say better, hyper specialization of a certain exclusive specific circumstances that gives you by itself the full ability to understand the whole system as such, right? That makes you understand how deeply difficult something is, but also if you don't have the courage of trying to sum things up and to express effectively a historical judgment and criticism, you're not good for much, even as a historian proper. And I think it's very beautiful as a historian that von Clausewitz stresses the critical element here, that if you want to actually create a theory of the art of war, you're not really brought to, you don't have really necessarily to judge the conduct, for example, of a certain military expedition in the past, but at least you should revolve your mind should revolve around it in some ways, so that you can at least get a better insight in the question, because that's still part of the historical inquiry, right? Trying to see what was possible to do, what not to do, and albeit very risky, This is probably at least the most promising phase of historical inquiry at that point. Then von Clausewitz writes, "We have said in our observations of the theory of the conduct of war that it should educate the mind of the commander for war, or that its teaching should guide his education. Also that it's not intended to furnish him with positive doctrines and systems which he can use like mental appliances." We have already seen this. Fundamentally, as von Clausewitz himself puts it, the manual, the theory of the art of war, should always be next, right, in the pocket of the commander. But the commander should revert to it every once in a while when he wants to look at certain things and to clarify his mind. But most of the times, the manual is going to remain in the commander's pocket, because the commander is busy actually trying to sort out what he's into. And in a moment in which that book cannot give him the exact answer for that contingent situation, right? So it's always it's important. This is not a positive doctrine, right? There is no positive doctrine that holds by itself. The doctrine should be understood in the way it's built and the reasons why, and possibly studying its improvement, which is there's always room for, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, "But if the construction of scientific formula is never required or even allowable in war to aid the decision on the case pretended, if truth does not appear there in a systematic shape, if it is not found in an indirect way but directly by the natural perception of the mind, then it must be the same also in a critical view." This is a very powerful phrase, because what von Clausewitz is saying here is that even when you are inquiring an historical event, you don't have just to interpret it in a merely scientific way, right? Not because this wouldn't be the most desirable way of doing it, but simply because it's impossible, right? Here it's never required, but not even allowable, right? We can't. History does have a scientific method per se, but it's this ultimate scientific formula that cannot, and it's usually not, in fact, created, right, required, even demanded. So, once again, another parallelism between waging war and studying history that requires this coup d'oeil, right, that von Clausewitz really attributes an enormous importance to. That is something that is a sort of sixth sense, right, and that you can't explain just through an equation, right? You essentially can express as a critical mind that has had a certain amount of experiences, saying, according to me, this is the reality, and even if maybe it's still an hypothesis, right? This is all an hypothesis. This is better. It should be a theory, like there should be evidence to back this, like it can't just be wishful thinking. But it's very beautiful because the way we all approach history and the various experiences and methods that bring us to build up our critical skill is really very different. Like, I don't know how much, but I see, if anything, just from a dialectical setting, that even people who essentially agree on the same historical opinion sometimes use different ways to get to it, right? There are different I don't want to use the term stratagem, because it's not that you're meant to trick someone, but you should always also be aware that someone could do that, right? That there's always food for thought in every single statement, but that also we should separate the purely speculative from the sound evidence, right? And that's why, in fact, given the diversity of opinion, actually humans tend to stick to similar opinions, right? To certain groups of opinions, right? And when we talk about military history, it's as if we were all sharing a minimal code of understanding of what we're talking about, right? And I see it even in the comment. You point out things I didn't say or didn't stress enough, because this whole complexity of thinking is sometimes very, very it's unique in itself, right? We think that every snowflake has a different pattern, right? But think about every different thought has a unique pattern, has a unique way of seeing things, and this naturally gets very interesting when it's not only an hypothesis, but it becomes a theory, and you can write a book about certain things, and you can speak your mind in that way, right? And there are unfortunately very few chances in your life to do this, right? One is that, just when you write your thesis, for many people, that's literally the last time that they can speak their mind in a kind of a scientific or attemptably scientific form, right? For most people, it really stops there, right? There are people who do it by profession because they have to write articles and stuff, but we are all very proud, I think, of our thinking, and that's also why it's difficult sometimes to speak, to, let's say, to have a dialogue proper, because there is ego involved in it, right? That is to say, I studied for years a certain specific topic, then someone comes to me and kind of dismantles my theory, and I start questioning rather since I know what I've written pretty well, right? What's in the other person's mind to have brought to that where the fault is, right? That's usually that kind of approach that people have, and it's as if, like, okay, let's stop it here regarding this, but this makes you, Von Clausewitz is perfectly aware of this problem, right? And he's saying, what he's saying here is that always beware while you learn that there is not quite an immediate understanding, right? Immediate in the etymological sense of the word, that not just temporally speaking, but without a medium, right? Without a mean that fundamentally transmutes in part even the same, that receives this information, it makes you receive this information in a different way. So there is always the first thing is always to be clear, to be systematic, to observe the thing as much as you can, looking at the wall, right? Always beware of those who make very specific researches, but do not have a broader competence in various fields, because this sometimes causes some of the greatest disasters at the benefit of an entire civilization. Sometimes there are certain theories that were not challenged just because those who were from other fields that were maybe tangent or even overlapping to it said, okay, well, that is the specialist, I will not challenge him, right? Also, be cautious, be careful when you criticize someone's competence, because aside from the subjective, emotional reactions you could get from the person, you can't fully know how much that person has absorbed as an actual knowledge of the thing, even in fact in a non-rational, not scientific way, right? That could be an edge sometimes. So always starting from the awareness that there may be something that you don't know, and you should always be extremely careful of that is not really the detail, it's an entire theoretical system that you may have in mind. It can be wrong, that it's easily the case, because it's always wrong. Guess what? That's not the truth. We don't have a true understanding of reality ever by any scientific standard, but it's always a good approach, right? You always be prudent, but at the same time being bold when you have an intuition and you want to give credit to it, because at the end of the day you really want to answer a question. This is how all historical studies start. I mean, do historical studies start because of rational reasons? They obviously don't. We all have our bias, we all have our favoritisms, our tastes, and etc. And therefore we start studying history because we come from that background, right? And then eventually things change, but it's still a very customized. That's what should also make you proud in learning, because learning is not repeating what other people have said, but is learning about it, but still having your mind functioning on those things and being able to criticize it, or to to be expand, to be increased, and you have nothing to lose, right? Because if you're right, that can be a good achievement in your life. If you're wrong, that will expand your intelligence at the end of the day, because you will learn the lesson, and you will be able to be more flexible minded in this regard, to incorporate other ideas, and to be able to form other ones. So that's really the beauty of learning and of knowledge. And if it's like a game. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. There is nothing really wrong even in failures, because you can always start, right? Restart, right? There are naturally other situations in the academy where there are ferocious rivalries and competitions and things like those, and even economical interests, unfortunately, which is legitimate at a certain level. Of course, I'm a capitalist, so I have no problem with that. But the point is also that there may be problems. Motivations that do not tend towards objectivity, and that's another major problem, right? If the point is that instead of historical inquiry you want to make political propaganda, well, you're not a historian, right? But how much of the historical inquiry is driven also by political reasons, in a healthy way, right? That's a good question, right? I'm not gonna answer to it, because we should evaluate case by case, but just to make you understand how problematic the whole thing is. So, von Clausewitz goes on and says, "It is true, as we have seen, that wherever complete demonstration of the nature of things would be too tedious, criticism must support itself on those truths which theory has established on the point," right? And that is to say, you can't be lazy sometimes to simply look at the theory of the art of war and saying, generally things happen in this way, so probably in this case it's a similar thing. This is always done in a way, right? It's what you learn. We do learn through systems, through certain specific ideas, right? That are like a building structure that you try to replicate to make it overlap to as a pattern over certain interpretations. But it's not always good. Like this is usually reasoning by analogy, right? I've seen that thing here, there, and there. Albeit I know that in every case it was a bit different. So, but I can spot that in this new case, maybe it's like it. But the point is also, and the beauty of it is that you don't often know this before, right? So the historical inquiry is a way to also satisfy your own personal curiosity. That is to say, have other people ever read this, cared about this problem, let's say, and if they haven't, or maybe they have just looked at part of it, is there something better that can say about it? This is very empowering, in my opinion, because most of the times it leads to good point, and I think it's better to aim at great systems, even if the challenge is greater, right? But at least at trying to build theories that have a sound impact. Now, the thing it's difficult to do, because naturally other people will have much more experience than you, have done similar things before. But the point is also, if the system is larger, so the theory is a wider system, that there are more chances that it's flawed in some ways, because it's more complicated to assess it correctly. Whereas, as I was saying before, if you just hyper-specialize on a single source or a single episode, very circumscribed, etc., the chances of being mistaken are difficult. That's why, for example, there are certain problems of, ancient military history that are yet to be determined in many ways, because there is always room for this, kind of inquiry, but you already talk with a medievalist, and those seem laughable problems, like saying how much can you actually find out, and also to objectivize, because if you lack the sources, and the sources are always those ones, right? There is a limit even to the to the meaning of what to the greatness, at least that is to say, we will not discover that we've been wrong about ancient warfare radically up to this point, right? There are certain things that objectively got wrong in the past, but still most of what believed at some point holds, because we see it kind of reiterated, like by inquiry. So albeit there is always this limit naturally to find out new things, it's always narrower in a certain measure, and it's something that must also be considered. That's why many researchers like to play easy by essentially, I don't know if it is true actually statistically, but I've seen, at least in certain fields that are probably also more recent in some ways, and rightfully so, that researchers tend to go towards the newest thing nobody has ever contemplated, right? But sometimes it's so bizarre, right, that even in there, how useful is it gonna be sometimes? And this doesn't mean we should kill, like, to create boundaries at all, but sometimes I think it's more important, like I'm doing, for example, without I don't sound particularly modest in this regard, but this has nothing to do whether I'm getting it correctly or not. But I mean, I personally think it's more challenging to criticize one theory that is somewhat still believed, right, and that has had already an impact, right? Sometimes it's really a matter of perspective, right? And it's obvious that sometimes we build some theories that are, I would say, like that give the impression that we have said everything about a certain topic, right? But the truth is that we haven't, after all, and it's not just about finding out the vacuum that is not being explored, but it's really about the theory in itself, as I was saying before, especially the greater systems that in this regard could and should be still discussed, right? And then von Clausewitz writes, but just as in war, the actor obeys these theoretical truths rather because his mind is imbued with them than because he regards them as objective inflexible laws, right? So criticism must also make use of them, not as an external law or an algebraic formula which fresh proof is not required each time they are applied, but it must always throw a light on this proof itself, leaving only to theory the more minute and circumstantial proof. Right. So, yeah, this is the point we were making, right? We should always be extremely careful about considering theory as some kind of scientific thing. Our theory is always built, sometimes in very empiric ways, right? We have seen it with military history itself. Well, what is it about? It's literally studying history, right? There's not much of at least you could build a theory of the art of war, even let's say by trying to analyze all the scientific evidence that you derive from the entire world in order to sort out what happens specifically in war, but how much that would take. It's impossible, as a matter of fact. It's impossible to sort out a system like that, right? And that's why the only way is to study military history and to get, at this point, substantial critical skill on the base of that same military awareness, right? And from Clausewitz, as we've seen, actually, this is the only way of doing it, right? The rest is very, very risky. And then he says, thus it avoids a mysterious and intelligible phraseology and makes its progress in plain language, that is, with a clear and always visible chain of ideas, right? And this is important, von Clausewitz says, because the idea is that you don't only you can always confrontate with theory what is under your eyes, But fundamentally, it's easier sometimes to look at the reality of the situation and simply say, it's because of trying to sort out that system, circumstantially, right? At that point by itself, than just trying to make it fit the theory, if just for the sake of it. That's not important. That's maybe just another tiny mutton that you have to add to the building of theory that you had maybe not encountered. And we know that every single military event is in this sense unique, right? It fits in part, surely, in what theory describes. And also in here, consider that theory can be, as we've seen, there is a hierarchy of theory. There are laws, principles, it descends into details sometimes. So here it's always an asymptotic view that von Clausewitz has of the of the universal spectrum, fundamentally, right? This whole thing is not, there is not a certified theory here that has certain specific limits. Here, von Clausewitz is explaining you about the relative value that this thing has within our relative knowledge, because our knowledge is not absolute but relative. So even our theoretical system is relative, right? And we have to understand in this sense in which scale it is, right? In how many times a certain phenomenon is going to happen in the same exact way, which is never, of course, but I mean, how much that is likely to happen, for example, in which measure and by which factors it is determined, right? Time after time. And this comes chiefly through this relative study, right? That is, however, the study of reality, and the study of war in itself, either, once again, by military experience or by military historical experience. And naturally the first one is more important, but the second one is complementary and also can produce good results sometimes. I mean, sometimes, considering, always in comparison to the waging of the direct military experience. But the point here is that we're talking a way or another still about history, because even the direct military experience confrontates you with a lot of important things you can't basically learn otherwise. But at the same time, this is still not enough. I mean, to have been there, and in order to know, for example, what actually happened, that's something that yourself can have a better understanding only when you study these things ex post. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, but this pious endeavor, if we may use the expression, has unfortunately seldom hitherto presided over critical examinations. Right, that is to say, von Clausewitz, I'm sorry to tell you, but after almost 200 years, things have not really changed much, right? And this is also a universal realization. Like, von Clausewitz is not criticizing a particular time in history here, his own. He is criticizing in general what tends to happen among humans, right? And therefore, this capacity to be open-minded, to be fair, to be objective, to be open to the various possibilities can be presented through reasoning is very rare, right? And we all follow, for evolutionary reasons, a bit of that, but mostly this kind of sticking to a kind of doctrine that we presume it is always kind of effective and successful, right? And that tends to dismiss the novelty, because it's a sort of danger to the relative stability is being obtained, right? Whereas it could be instead an improvement, etc. And von Clausewitz says the most of these critical examinations have rather been emanations of a species of vanity, a wish to make a display of ideas. This is also true. We do it all the time, right? It's very difficult, once again, to make a very sound and good point in scientific analysis, right? Scientific meant, let's say, methodologically speaking, when also we have limited times and means, right? Take YouTube, right? I talk about things that normally have never heard on here, but I realized that, I mean, YouTube is definitely not a good mean, and the time that I have at disposal is also relatively short. So a lot of I suffer from the fact that things I tell you are that are could be way better researched or presented or explained, and that's something that takes time, and I don't have all the time. So everything is relative to the actual means at disposal, and it's way more difficult to actually give a precise explanation than it really seems, right? It's like a bit, well, I don't know. For example, I'm commenting this text, I'm criticizing it, I'm doing it, I'm improvising, right? I haven't prepared anything. I read this stuff like for 5 minutes before I begin this thing in 2 or 3 languages, and then I get the point and explain it, right? But I could do much better, right? As far as I say, I could retranslate everything. For example, I use this translation in English just for the sake of simplicity, but the German text is much more effective, and this is also kind of probably the worst translation that exists around, but that's exactly when I read it in the other languages before, because I want to get the point right? And of course, even in here there is something that I haven't met, terrible mistakes. I realized that this is a very sophisticated text, and of course there are many approximations, not necessarily misinterpretations, but essentially the translation itself makes lose a lot of the original content for its precision and beauty, even, right? That here Von Clausewitz is displaying also remarkable linguistical skills in terms of semantics and of metaphors, etc. It's even poetic, as we've seen many times. But so this is just an example of how limited certain things are, and this thing of the vanity is also important. Like, why do we come here and talk about this stuff, right? Why do I do it, for example? Is there a part of vanity? I don't know, probably, right? Which action is not partly driven by vanity in a certain sense, but I personally do it because I think it can be useful, for example, for me, in many ways. I don't know, one day that this could help someone, or I could meet people who want to know more, and who could do, I don't know, there could be a broader interaction with a greater commitment. There are many reasons why we do this, but the point, definitely, at least for me, is not to say these things because saying, oh, look at me, this is all to von Clausewitz, right? I just try to explain it, and naturally I pretend to understand a bit of it. But yeah, there is that minimal vanity that can derive from every accomplishment, but I don't care very much, right? I've never been especially I hate exhibitionism, which is kind of weird because I'm uploading all of this stuff, but I try not to be I never talk about me, actually. And I don't think you're interested in, rightfully so. This should be just about the Vom Kriege. I add sometimes these reflections that I think can be helpful, right? If you're wondering where this thing all goes to, because this text must be understood, and that understanding is not immediate. Once again, you may have to make an effort. So if you just listen to it, let's assume you take an audiobook, there's just a voice narrating the text, you will not get it, right? It's normal, it happens to everybody. You should study this thing. So that's why I stop on the idea and I comment it, because I think it's more important than just and it's a display of ideas in itself, right? But anyhow, von Clausewitz goes on and says, the first evil which we constantly stumble upon is a lame, totally inadmissible application of certain one-sided systems as of a formal code of laws, right? So this fundamentally one-sided view of a certain a reality that naturally excludes by itself, by definition, part of what should be instead known, and this sort of inflexibility, I interpreted this in this way, so it's my point, right? It's something we rarely do on Schwerpunkt, I think. Every time there is an idea, we try to understand it better, to understand it in relative terms. Like, this cannot be a formal code of laws, and especially in the reality we live in, we don't see much of this, right? And we have always to understand it. We're talking about things like politics, war, society, where's the formal code of laws in them, right? Von Clausewitz accomplishes this enormous task of telling us effectively what war is in general, in outline, and how this essentially works in all situations, without giving you the delusion that this is going to be enough by itself to tell you how it works. And instead, there are many people who say, just do this and you will make it, right? And that's the worst thing that also von Clausewitz is fighting against, in that it causes some of the greatest disasters out there. And von Clausewitz opens even here a very brilliant, consideration, at least to a realization, that is, but it is never difficult to show the one-sidedness of such systems, right? And this only requires to be done once to throw discredit for every critical judgments which are based on them. That is to say, when someone uses this kind of apodictic, arrogant, one-sided, crystallized, dogmatic attitude, I mean, it's very, very, very easy to target it effectively, right? Yeah, you just say, think about how wrong this is, and how this theory does not hold because of these factors. And sometimes these people kind of enclose within themselves more, and it's natural. And probably we perceive it as, they will never change. They're the bad, evil people. Maybe you really broke through after all, and the more, the harsher the reaction is, and the more you've actually accomplished within them, and maybe these people will keep believing what you've wrote them in the future. And that's a very effective. That's a painful process, right? It happens to all of us to even be corrected, be wrong, and we realize that we are wrong because we essentially excluded other factors from the equation. So this one-sided system as a formal code of laws doesn't quite fit even our learning process in general. Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, we have here to deal with a definite subject, and as the number of possible systems after all can be but small, therefore also they are themselves the lesser evil. That is to say, these one-sided interpretations are, the more they were, let's say, and this more stupid they would sound, right? Because they're so narrow that every person would understand at that point that they're useless. So, as a bright side of the story, it's kind of that there are a few of these theories after all. Right, and because they hold for a minimal, credibility, but then they're still kind of relatively easy to debunk. And in general, they can be seen, as von Clausewitz says, as lesser evils, in this way, right? The problems are really other, right? Because it's like, consider that von Clausewitz here is criticizing naturally. The underlying the thing is this of the the principe de la guerre, right? The principle of internal lines, and that's, for example, an intelligence system, right? That it's wrong, but it says intelligent things within it. The problem, from Clausewitz says, is when there is a lot of basically there is even a lack of logical connection, and people are going to roughly believe or be convinced by it anyway. So it's easier actually to convince people through an irrational thinking, maybe because it's dictated by a certain tone, a certain spirit, right, a certain attitude. You can easily see it on social networks when someone freaks out, and I don't know, that there is someone that is indignated by an episode, and will shout out it loud about it, and put the content out there. You probably say, "Oh wow, this person has a point," because I don't know what he's talking about, but he seems it seems that his motivation is great enough to justify his point. This is actually a great risk, because it's obviously an irrational take on the thing. When maybe you even could sort out the thing was wrong because you had a kind of a good opinion maybe of that specific issue, and you listen to these people and start saying, oh well, maybe also the other side is right. That is usually a symptom of actually a weak understanding of the issue in itself, right? And it happens all the time, and it's easy to shift the people, especially the masses' feelings in this regard, very, very easily. And this is a great threat, a great danger to the same historical inquiry. And von Clausewitz, in fact, points this out and says, much greater is the evil which lies in the pompous retinue of of technical terms, scientific expressions and metaphors which these systems carry in their train, and which, like a rebel, like the baggage of an army broken away from its chief, hang about in all directions. A beautiful metaphor here that he uses himself to actually get to a solid point, that is to say there are certain expressions and way of saying, you think about political language, how many expressions you hear that now are somewhat common or popular, that everybody use and that emerge from some specific environment, and everybody repeats without even knowing what it means. There are many terms that we even criticize in Schwerpunkt that are poorly used, like the concept of symmetric warfare, right? That is sometimes categorized as if there was an actually symmetric warfare and distinguished neatly from an asymmetrical one. The point is that war is always asymmetric, is usually not done, and it's actually the most effective from a healthy intellectual point of view. And yet, no, we prefer to repeat it because maybe the journalists and television said it and it sounds cool and looks cool, right? And that we don't understand even the meaning of it. Take the meanings as grand strategy. Basically, do not have any meaning because it's not strategy by definition when they actually talk about it. And part of the reason why you can correct this is because simply study what strategy is from the Vom Kriege, and it's not about saying what von Clausewitz thinks versus the other guys think. It's about the fact, understanding what the hell we're talking about in the first place, and how we can get to thinking about strategy. And when you use grand strategy and realize, for example, it's not even just military, it's not even just strategical. You realize that what the hell did we call it grand strategy? And didn't have any better way of doing it. We have criticized often the term geopolitics as well, that by itself doesn't make much of a sense, at least in the way it's used widespread in strategic, in alleged strategic analysis. And it's a great risk because it brings with itself actually the seeds of very deep misconceptions at a political and social level that are used in turn, that are exploited by people, by governments, by other associations that that have an interest to stress even this, to make this sort of semantic war and to de-rationalize our language that by itself has actually a pretty good degree of precision. And this goes for any other political field, right? And you think about how we change the semantics of terms like discrimination. There's a neutral term, and now it becomes basic discrimination equates racism, which is completely not the case. There are lots of these problems actually all around us, and in the weakness, the moral weakness of a society starts when you start tolerating this misuse of language, because you're basically surrendering the language to people that are mishandling that, right? It's like making people make damage, letting people make damage, and okay, say, okay, but I don't want to think about it, and in the meanwhile, your freedoms, your rights are eroded in the process. It's a very complicated topic. We never fully addressed it, but it all starts from this as well. What von Clausewitz is saying here that it's not even the object, of course, that is kind of non-existing, right? All this, fake news stuff, all work actually putting realistic stuff in it, right? It's not that the people come out and say there are dragons and that's it, right? They will try to convince you that the earth is flat, right? And there is a huge movement behind this, and you can, and in there it happens exactly what von Clausewitz is saying here, that they lose completely the plot, so that they talk about an astonishing amount of actual evidence, but completely misconnecting it in logical terms. As this army that, as von Clausewitz says in the metaphor, without a chief, hangs about in all directions, and it's still the army, but it's without a head. It behaves very weirdly, right? So that's what most people do, right? And it's incredible how conspiracy theories are so effective sometimes, or better. They're actually very stupid, but that how easy it is to exploit so many people through it. And guess why? Because so many people are stupid in that regard. But it's never a full stupidity. There is always an intelligence in it and a motivation in it. Never underestimate that element. There is always like, our world is tremendously competitive, and that's how we're programmed. So every time you see something particularly stupid having great success, just know that it's not just because people are stupid, but because there is an interest behind it of some form, right? It's an additional thing. And von Clausewitz says, any critic who has not adopted a system, either because he has not found one to please him, or because he has not yet able to make himself master of one, will at least occasionally make use of a piece of one, as one would use a ruler to show the blunders committed by a general. So it's another way of saying, when you don't understand history because things don't add up, you basically try to bridge that gap to force your theory, right? Then von Clausewitz says, the most of them are incapable of reasoning without using help here and there, some shreds of scientific military theory, right? That is also to say, okay, let's use military theories if we were talking about a dogma, and let's pretend that it fits in every single damn context, right? So using it effectively as a dogma, right? And it's done all the time, right? That if you look at people who are building their own military historical competence, I was saying competence, but you get what I'm saying here. Equally, because they in fact say things that are incompetent, right? Because they use actual points from real military history and military theory, but they misuse them, so that everything sounds, even with a certain lexicon, right? That is often done. That it's like the alleged evidence of conspiracy theories. There's always something true in it, because otherwise nobody would believe it. But it's the logical connections that are completely flawed, and they are not demonstrated. And at that point, it's very easy to actually dismantle this stuff and to make appear people under a bad light. I've personally done it every time, but every single time I also realized that these people were in the way they were doing the thing in some way a step ahead from me, that maybe they knew something I also had wondered whether it was true or not at the moment, and I had to search confirmation for, because even if I wasn't completely prepared about it. So that I can easily dismiss a certain theory if I don't find it correct, but fundamentally, there is still some conspirationist out there that still knows one thing more than I do, and that is still wrong about the world thing, right? But still knows one thing more than me. And this is very interesting, historically speaking, because it makes you realize that there is always someone that knows something more than you. Like, every person on this world knows one thing more than you do. And this is beautiful as well, because it makes you realize that you have nothing but to learn in many ways, and that it never ends, right? It's always very, it's somewhat comforting, but it's also, if you're kind of conservative at this point because you pretend you have understood all, that's a moment in which probably there is something wrong with your thinking, because you have stopped at one point instead of being aware that you can't but improve. And this is very difficult for moral relativism, right? Because it's exactly by adding further information that you get a much better dimensioned idea of what you're talking about. So that's why it never stops, never ends, right? That it never arrives to the point it says, this thing is like this point, over, right? There are, of course, in major questions of theory, like if you pretend to, I don't know, now to explain how the Battle of Waterloo went for real, as if it wasn't studied by, more than 200 years, and we hadn't basically figured out that all we could figure out, right? Either you find a hidden manuscript written by Napoleon himself telling something completely different about a battle, and how likely is that, right? How are you going to do that? And if you don't use historical sources, what's the point of an historical inquiry anyway? But that was just an extreme example. But there are people who actually do this all the time, who try to sell you. For example, think about all the times we use the term military revolution, right? Just for sensationalism and selling cheap stuff, if not garbage, to people who understand nothing about it, because it sounds like a revolution, like it's something so deep and changing. Like what makes me laugh all the time is when people get weird about the fact that we're making wars with drones now, right? We're just like telecommanded things you could use even when you were a kid, and now everything has changed because of drones. Like war has become so different and so much more controversial because now we have drones. Like we can't kill a person one click, right? Yeah, as if we didn't do it before already, or drones, for example, were actually the most secure way of gunning down people, compared like the most collateral damage is done by AC-130s, right? They're all humanly they're meant, right? So actually drones are pretty good, and they even kill less people than other means we had before. I mean, less innocents, I mean, and they're very effective. But things like drones are like literally one of the most stupid tools that we have already used in one way or another. That war is not about these things. Many people are illegitimately impressed by this thing. It scares the hell out of me because it makes you realize how low. I mean, this is to level almost to the ground in terms of the level of understanding of military history. Like, what the hell do you think that is gonna change, right? If you don't even get the connection of the Clausewitzian Trinity before politics, society, and war, you concentrate just on weapons, on individual soldiers. Like that's not a military, a strategic culture. That's just like go play video games. That's maybe you can learn something from at that level, paradoxically. So, but aside from that, this is just my habitual rants. But here Von Clausewitz says the most of them we have already read this. Excuse me, I was saying that the most of these fragments. Oh yeah, so here Von Clausewitz basically is listing now what are the rhetorical expedients that those who want to confuse the picture, right, employ. It says the smallest of these fragments, consisting in mere scientific words and metaphors, are often nothing more than ornamental flourishes of critical narration. I think I already read this, possibly. Then it goes on and says, now it is in the nature of things that all technical and scientific expressions which belong to a system lose their property, if they ever had any, as soon as they are distorted and used as general axioms or small crystalline talismans, in fact, which have more power of demonstration than simple speech. And the same exact thing. Symmetrical warfare, geopolitics, grand strategy, right? And all this stuff that we could go on with Luttwak, with Hansen, with a lot of even people that are in their field are actually intelligent. I'm not saying that whoever uses this stuff is an idiot, but if you make your living and academic career, let's say, on this stuff, it's a big problem, because if you miss the point there, you're creating actually even a pretty collateral damage to the rest of society is going to read you. So that there are many people who buy the Reganian hoplitism of the ancient Hellenic polis, or we will see these things step by step, but never think that a word, a proper terminology only, is enough to make your mind work, right? And that often what sounds that actually there is a way of making things sound complicated to intrigue people, to letting them think, in confusing them, and therefore making them suspect that maybe they have not understood because they're not competent, right? Then when you get competent about them, you because we all pass through that, right? We're not born knowing those things, so we all share this same experience. Then you get to the point you know more. You say, "What the fuck? What are these people talking about?" And now I see what they were trying to say, and they were wrong about. And it gives you confidence, because from one side it's always the paradox here that the more you know, the less you realize to actually know, but that still gives you an edge in real life, so that things you know actually work better, right, than before. That realization. And here he also addressed the fact that these theoretical notions are dealt with like a scientific, almost crystalline, axiomatic fashion, right? That can, these crystalline talismans, like these definitions that are. I mean, what is interesting here is that von Clausewitz realizes how petty these terminologies are, in the sense that they are small things. Like that, he realizes that those who build fake news actually build them on the base of these small little changes, like using a word rather than another, semantic tone rather than another, and already putting the conversation over a certain level, right? In you come to the point when you grow up and you're able to feel distaste just for these meanings, because they don't buy you anymore. They don't make you feel like they gave you this, in fact, talismanic force. Because there is something really irrational about this. This is very carefully, von Clausewitz' word choice is very, very, very intelligent in this regard, because it's really what it feels like. And another thing that's very fascinating in this is that there is the difference. He spots the difference between the written and the spoken. Because what is written sometimes is, it's difficult. People don't even usually read things. They just like to think that something in it has a sense. I think it happens sometimes even with my videos, right? But if, let's assume that you were having a conversation, you were actually speaking with someone, and someone asked you more about the thing you said, that exoteric term, and then asks for an explanation, like, what does it mean? And then the usual answer you get from those who really are making things up is, it depends, it's in perspective, it's a complex thought, and it just revolves around the point without getting it. And we all use this strategy, actually. I also do it sometimes when I say I mean a concept is very important, but I know I will address another time, and maybe at the moment I don't even remember clearly, but I say, okay, I recognize this is important, and we'll talk about it another time, because it really is, at least, right? But sometimes this spoken forms are brought forward at a level that is in fact, very bold, and as von Clausewitz said before, like even pretty easily subject to criticism, so that it's important to know that it's easy to dismantle, to debunk this stuff. Then von Clausewitz writes, "Thus, it has come to pass that our theoretical and critical books, instead of being straightforward, intelligible dissertations, in which the author always knows at least what he says and the reader what he reads, are brimful of these technical terms, which form dark points of interference where author and reader part company. Now here it's really a communication problem, von Clausewitz points out, because it says, and it is true, right? If you read certain books sometimes, you have a critical intent, as it should be intellectually healthy to do all the time, and at the same time living the benefit of maybe that this person still, at least up to the last page, is not able to blow your mind in a certain way, is that there are certain passages that are objectively not clear, right? Certain terms, certain definitions that do not quite get to the point. Can even it's also a strategy. Like it depends. Like I've met a lot of very competent articles, for example, that were explaining something, but deliberately not exposing themselves on other issues and writing things that you had really to go deep in linguistically to get how they were kind of avoiding the thing, because they, this is interesting. We may explain it better when we'll see it, but I should make a direct example otherwise. But that's also a problem, right? It can be sometimes it can be mere misunderstanding, right, between systems of different minds, right? And von Clausewitz says, but frequently they are something worse, in fact, right? It's rare to be for them just mere, chances of misunderstanding. It says, being nothing but hollow shells without any kernel. That is to say, when very often actually, when you're on a book, you read, what the hell does this phrase mean, or this concept mean, or how valid it is also the case that it actually doesn't mean anything, right? And seriously. And von Clausewitz says, the author himself has no clear perception of what he means, contents himself with vague ideas, which if expressed in plain language would be unsatisfactory even to himself. Right, so that's why also challenging people directly, saying, what the hell do you mean by this? And a person may well know, in fact, what the problem is, because at least by writing them, he should have thought more thoroughly about them. Then von Clausewitz writes, a third fault in criticism is the misuse of historical examples. This is very important, and a display of great reading or learning. This happens all the time, right? I've look at that battle. I know better because look at that battle, or I know better because I have so many books, right? And I've read so much, and I've done this and I've done that, and then you can't even explain yourself properly. That's a problem. Von Clausewitz writes, what the history of the art of war is, we have already said, and we shall further explain our views on examples and on military history in general in special chapters, which Fortress von Clausewitz does. And so this is just later. It says, one fact merely touched upon in a very cursory manner may be used to support the most opposite views, and 3 or 4 such facts of the most heterogeneous description, brought together out of the most distant lands and remote times and heaped up, generally distract and bewilder the judgment and understanding without demonstrating anything. I was looking at it, today, but it's kind of a different example. But it's very fascinating here that it's very easy when, especially you're in a hurry, and you don't want to stop too much to write certain thing because it takes too long and the article is too long. And you say, oh, look at what happening here and there, like everybody knows, right, what happened here and there, right? And actually you don't explain what you mean, and you're even able to build up something that doesn't quite make sense in that regard. And that can even really shift the attention towards directions that are very, very misleading, right, by themselves. And von Clausewitz writes, for when exposed to the light, they turn out to be trumpery rubbish made us to show off the author's learning. And it's risky because it's a common thing to do, especially when, as I was saying before, you really don't want to explain really the point in itself, and you pretend just to explain through examples you don't explain yourself. And yeah, And then von Clausewitz writes, but what can be gained for practical life by such obscure, partly false, confused, arbitrary conceptions? So little is gained that theory on account of them has always been a true antithesis of practice, and frequently a subject of ridicule to those whose soldierly qualities in the field are above question. Right? It's a very harsh statement. And von Clausewitz knows what he's saying. He's not being self-referential as a military man. He's simply telling you how often, this person has seen people dying for such idiotic decisions, right? It's not a matter of anecdote, right? This is literally from a stupid decision based on a fashion. People die, like insisting on the oblique order at still in the Napoleonic era, and getting Prussia destroyed. And von Clausewitz was in it, right? So he saw the mess that such ideas could cause, and he's referring literally to that. So I point this out because culturalism is saying, von Clausewitz is just self-referential because it's just that specific military man from the Prussian, from Napoleonic Prussia that saw through those events, but that is not considering our factors. Is just talking about his own times. No, he's talking about things that happen all the freaking time, everywhere in history. People making stupid decisions because they had to stick to abstract idea detached from reality. And this phrase is very beautiful. It says that theory has been always a true antithesis of practice, right? On account of these mistakes, right? That there's always been something seriously wrong about trying to make a scientific and positivistic and progressistic attempt to define what will always happen in war, so that you do that move and everything will always go well. And it's a problem. We keep doing it because you understand it's not about making a choice or like choosing red pill or blue pill, right? Here it's that there are billions of pills and you don't even have the time to count them, and you have to sort out to find out the best and the better answer, right, at the moment. That's what war is. And reducing it to a simpler system is stupid, because what we should get to is actually to understand the broader system, not the stupid one. That's exactly it. Come on. You should consider everything that happens in reality. If you start detaching that, if you start thinking that essentially you will solve a system by approximating it. The point is, okay, you're somewhat obliged to do it most of the times, but not because you have the presumption that approximation is going to be the simplification of reality, because reality is reality. Yours is just an abstraction in that regard. So you approximate just if you can, at the moment, having a benefit from it. If the sake is just, let's simplify things, let's not consider things that happen in reality, like principle of internal lines, because a geometrical principle is all going to count on the battlefield. If you don't even consider morale, what kind of usage is it going to be? It's like war gameism, right? Where's the pride, the historical intellectual inquiry in pride to rigidly categorize things like armies, soldiers, military cultures, or even the military environment in itself? That's what culturalists often do, like separating neatly politics from war. Aside from the fact that once again, they have not even read the Vom Kriege, but how can you think, if you're stressing the complexity of culture, that you can't separate what is military and what is political in a culture? I mean, how stupid that can be by definition. We'll have to one day to really launch a torpedo at culturalism in a dedicated video, because my god, that is disgusting. That is one of the most utterly disgusting and actually crypto racist, and because there is no way out of it, and supposedly they're going in another direction, even attributing to von Clausewitz responsibilities for things like World War the First or World War the Second. I mean, Keegan, let's be honest, you smoked too badly, right? There is something seriously wrong with you. Study von Clausewitz, read it even, because you haven't done that. Yeah, other rant, but I love this stuff because I really want to make people aware about this. Like, this is not a joke. These are enormously, imposing problems. And the sad thing is that most people live within them without realizing that they actually hold these views, even if they don't know what Keegan is, what culturalism is. But they actually believe what they believe. So, yeah. Then in conclusion, von Clausewitz writes, but it is impossible that this could have been the case if theory, in simple language and by natural treatment of those things which constitute the art of making war, had merely sought to establish just so much as admits of being established, if, avoiding all false pretensions and irrelevant display of scientific forms and historical parallels, it had kept close to the subject and gone hand in hand with those who must conduct affairs in the field by their own natural genius. This is very, very important. It contains interesting ideas in the sense that here, from a strictly linguistical point of view, we understood it. We have to be simple, logical, and not pretending that everything can be fit in a rigid categorization, right? But the thing that also impresses me here is how history can be a double-edged sword, right? We've seen how important for von Clausewitz's military history is for building up the theory of the art of war. It is fundamentally based on history, right? Because even direct experience is eventually delivered, like with taught through history as such, and it's imperfect in it as such at the same time. But history can also be misused in the sense that if you build up a theory of the art of war by essentially just forcing the new evidence in the things that have already happened historically speaking, you are essentially denaturating that same historical notion, right? It's like those people who say, history always repeats itself. History never repeated itself, fortunately, not even once, right? Because everything that happens, literally every little thing that happens, it's never happened before and will never happen again, right? This sounds as a very philosophical statement, but it's actually true, because you see, even if you looked at things like genocide, right, not even a single genocide has been equal to another. And I'm convinced that a person who listens to this say, this guy has always has surely second intention, because he wants to downgrade certain genocides from others. No, because if you kill a person, that's gonna be it. Like, you can't kill one person, 1 million person. A crime against humanity remains a crime against humanity. But the point is rather, what can you do to prevent another genocide in that regard? By thinking that these are the new Nazis or the new Maoists, and that's as simple as that. That's just a pattern that replicates itself a new time after a different way time after time. Or is it maybe that every epoch, every context is different, and in order to avoid, senseless massacres of innocent civilians, you have to actually stay open and think that these things can happen again, yes, but in a completely different way, in a completely different context. That actually what goes on also in terms of killing people is taking place right now, and we don't really even care about it, because we just think about certain things that happened in the past without seeing what happens today. Even in here, no political, no rhetorical questions like, there are many examples in this regard historically, but you understand what it means here. Not the fact that people will be killed criminally is something that can happen in many different. Well, look at terrorism in Europe in the from the tenth of the third millennium. What would have thought about that? Like, we knew about terrorism even before 9/11. I mean, there had been other attacks, even to a World Trade Center, but we've never seen 9/11, right? And the point there is, how could have we prevented this? Like, thinking in the way other terrorist attacks had ever happened at that point, and excluding the fact that someone could fly into the World Trade Center or the Pentagon, that nobody had literally ever done. Had history repeated itself on 9/11? No, it was something truly unique and truly monstrous and astonishing. It's probably one of the most, it's probably the single most horrible thing that I've experienced, historically speaking. Hopefully, thankfully, I mean, at a distance in my life, it's something deeply impacted me when it happened. Even if I'm distant from it, relatively distant from it, at least geographically. But the point is, who would have thought it? And what do you think the genocides that took place will not happen again? Even in other forms, you're not even told. Do you know, for example, what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghur Turks? Nobody. Very few people actually know this, and this is happening right now. I don't want to even think about what happened there with coronavirus. But look at the Uyghur Turks of the westernmost regions of China and see what happened to them, right? And see and think of the fact that nobody gives a freaking damn about this. So don't tell me that history repeats itself, that everything is alike, that we need a perfect copy of Hitler or Stalin to have a genocide, right? We don't, and that's the most terrifying realization that you can acquire in that regard. You can't. This is the moral von Clausewitz is giving you here, that you can't force historical parallelism. That if you force historical parallelism, like saying this is how it happened like then, you're not a true historian. There's something seriously wrong within your critical skills, because you're basically giving up to understand what it actually happened at this point by buying it, like trading it with an explanation someone else has already done for you, studying things that happened back then, right? And people do this all the freaking time. Like, we are sclerotizing. I think especially we are. I don't know how the rest of the world is changing its mind, but as I've seen in the West, we have stagnated. Definitely, we have not. We have fallen asleep substantially to a lot of things, and now they're coming back, right? Not in the same way, but in ways that are explainable through the fact that I don't know why. Well, this kind of gets political. Let's skip it. But let's say, okay. Well, let's not talk about why it gets to political specific. But not because I would take a political side. It's just that I think that you can't pretend to even enforce certain anniversaries or to read certain historical events just through your, this thing happened, therefore we should think about it in the same exact way ever, right? This is another controversial topic. I mean, to me, it's more likely to genocide to happen again, at least having the seeds of it potentially, if we flatten the idea that you have to think only one way towards a historical event, right? That the idea that this has nothing to do with condoning crimes, because crimes remain crimes. There is no moral relativism in this, but the point here is there is a deep deresponsabilization of society and politics today, and I fear that we will pay the consequences of it sooner than we think. But anyway, so let's stop it here because we have actually finished the fifth chapter. We'll pass to the examples of the sixth next time, and we will then which is the last chapter of the second book, and then we'll pass to the third book that deals with strategy, which is an enormous deal, very fascinating, and this is like a great introduction. Now, this is one of the most interesting aspects of the story, and for today we stop here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time. See you next time.